psychologist, which is a way of segueing into an introduction to this talk. So I've always been a graduate professor. Any of you students at Purdue or studied at Purdue? At my table before, there were a whole bunch of folks from Purdue. I actually taught at Purdue in their graduate program in organizational psychology. And I was a partner in a firm that was acquired by AON. Now, AON is a global risk management firm. And so for the first several years after my company was acquired, they said, what are you psychologists, organizational psychologists, doing in this big risk company? And I actually didn't have a good answer. So after about 4 or 5 years of this, I decided to develop an answer. And the answer is the presentation I'm going to go through today, and I really hope it's going to generate a conversation. And that is talent risk, a key but overlooked component of enterprise risk management. You know, I was at the 2 sessions, the 2 keynotes, which were both amazing. And there was a lot of allusion to the notion of talent risk. And Sonny, in the second talk, talked about some of the factors, the demographic risks that I'll touch on. But what this talk is about is putting some real discipline and rigor around assessing for your organizations the level of talent-based risk. It doesn't just have to be pie-in-the-sky discussions about the fact that we don't have enough people, or that we're making bad decisions, or that our folks don't have the requisite skills. But rather, I hope to demonstrate, at least in my hour, that this can be a rigorous kind of process. So we begin with trying to understand what enterprise risk management is. It's a relative. How many of you in your organizations or organizations you know about have a chief risk officer? So many organizations, more and more of them, in the C-suite, have something called a chief risk officer whose business it is to worry about the company's enterprise risk. So it's the whole notion of understanding what kinds of risks are out there that represent a real challenge to the survivability of the organization. What we're going to talk about, I'm going to very briefly give you an overview of enterprise risk management. Come on in. Enterprise risk management, what is it? By the way, all my slides, afterwards, if you want copies of my slides, just leave me your card and I'll send them to you. Because they're busy, it's a lot of content, and I'm going to sort of breeze through because my intent is to give you a flavor of what is enterprise risk management, what is the talent component of enterprise risk management, then what are some of the trends out there in our society and the economy that impact on talent risk that, in my view, are increasing talent risk for many organizations? How do you go about in an organization assessing what your primary risks are? And that's important because that leads to the final section. How do you decide what to invest in to mitigate risk? Where are you going to get the best bang for your buck in talent-related solutions that are going to mitigate risks that might actually ruin your enterprise if you're not addressing those talent-based enterprise risks. So that's sort of the journey that we're going to take very quickly. So in corporate America, at least, enterprise risk is a maturing discipline. There are lots of organizations that are looking to build out their management of risk to make sure that they don't get into the kinds of situations that we saw in the financial services organizations and many other organizations. I worked, for example, in the pharmaceutical that a couple of years ago made a decision. It's a person made a decision. It didn't come up down from on high, right? It wasn't a natural element. They made a decision to make their quality control processes more efficient. And in the process, created loopholes. created gaps that ended up leading to them producing a poor quality product. Again, minor, out to Six Sigma and beyond, but this is a huge organization that led to huge reputational risk and huge financial loss in the marketplace, and loss of consumer confidence, loss of shareholder confidence, reduction of shareholder value, a ripple effect that went into the billions and billions of dollars, and that they're still trying to recover from. So there's a focus on setting risk appetite, and just a general awareness of risks that might be to the enterprise. I'm not going to go into this. I think people in the back probably can't even read this, but we have, AON, my company, has a risk maturity model where we go into an organization saying, how well developed is your risk management here? And as you'll see in a minute, Standard & Poor's and other external agencies are very interested in looking at a company's level of risk management maturity, because it's a message to the shareholders. You invest in this company, they don't manage their risks well, they may be making a lot of money right now, but they might actually not exist in 5 years because of some of the risks that they're taking that are not being well managed. So we have, the details really don't matter, but we have a 1 to 5 scale that we can go into a company and objectively assess the maturity with which they manage enterprise-level risks. If it's still a mystery about what is enterprise-level risk, I'm going to give you a chart with it in a second. It's 1 or 2 slides down. But I just want you to see that there is data to show that those companies that invest in managing their risks in a more mature, disciplined way, building a governance structure to make sure that they're not doing things that will get the enterprise in trouble, also are companies in which that kind of maturity is awarded by the stock market in terms of shareholder value. This is just to give you a sense of some of the hallmarks of an advanced enterprise risk management approach. So for those of you in the back of the room, we're just going to highlight a few of them. That the board understands and has a commitment to analyzing risk and objectively making decisions about risk. Are we going to build a plant in an area that is on the verge of political instability? Or not? Maybe we will, but we're going to do it with eyes wide open with respect to our risk, and perhaps with some insurance support in case things don't turn out the way they are anticipated. Is there a senior level executive who has responsibility for risk management? Is risk management insights integrated into the talent processes? So you heard Sunny before talk about a shortfall between the skill needs in agriculture and the availability of talent being produced by schools. Does the company factor that gap into their risk analysis? This is, I'm going to skip the one on governance, just get right to this. So think about your own organizations. In our model, we tend to think about risk in 4 areas: strategic, operational, regulatory, and financial. And you see examples of each. So you're in your business, you have a partner, a supply chain partner, that supplies you on a regular basis with product X, which is critical to your processes. So, you're in your business and you have a supplier for fertilizer, I'm totally making this up, that you're counting on delivery at certain key points around the globe on a scheduled basis that's been contracted for. What's the risk if that supplier goes out of business? What is the risk if that supplier is headquartered in some place that has geopolitical instability? What is the risk where weather ruins some of their modes of transportation, whether it be trains or boats or whatever? So not anticipated, and if there are no mitigation strategies put in place to minimize the impact on the risk of those risk factors on the viability of the business. Y'all with any questions so far about enterprise risk when we get to the talent component right now? So the question is, I'm going to go back to the earlier slide. Well, let's ask this question first. In your businesses, which of these or any others do you see as key enterprise risks? One or two of the most important enterprise risks for the viability of your business? Somebody, anybody? Reputation. Okay. So I believe it's either Forbes or Fortune, right, who produces each year a list of like the 100 most important brands and what they're worth. So clearly reputational risk is critical to many, many organizations. I mean, we're living, we're right now in Atlanta. There's a company that you're going to visit tomorrow night where, you know, one way to look at it is their reputation is 90% of their value. I'm talking obviously about Coke. Right? It's less about the product and it's more about the brand and the image and what it represents to people all over the world. So, reputational risk. Now the next question is, to what extent are there talent factors that impact on reputational risk? So, give me an example. Let's say if you were a company and one of the big enterprise risks was reputation, how would talent potentially impact on that risk? That's right. So if you have salespeople who are seen as unprofessional, for example, that could, and self-centered and selfish and not at all customer focused, that could hurt your reputational risk. That's a pure talent question. I was asked by the Chief Human Resources Officer of one of the largest companies in the world, what did it do to our reputation when a year ago one of our executive committee members was let out in handcuffs from his office? How did that play? And how did that impact on our reputation? That's a talent question. So one of the issues I would ask you to think about in your business is, are talent risks increasing or decreasing? And by talent risks, we mean anything related to people that impacts on these kinds of enterprise risks. You think they're increasing or decreasing?
Depends on the age.
So demographic factors is one of those risk factors, and you heard that in your business, actually demographic risks are increasing. The presentation earlier seemed to indicate at least, you know, people don't want to go into producer positions. The schools are not producing the scientific knowledge that, you know, there's enough skilled people to go into the skilled positions. So it would seem to be, and especially if you look at 2050 and the need to double food production in the world and everything that we've heard in the last couple hours, it would seem to me that talent risk is increasing. Now, it may be different in different parts of the world. So, you know, a big focus of our conference here is on Africa, and you heard the comments about Nigeria and about Tanzania. But in some parts of the world, probably risk isn't increasing or not as much, and in other parts of the world, very much so. To your knowledge, do you think that in the C-suites in your organizations or organizations you know about, that there is a sensitivity to the talent side of enterprise risk? That they think about talent risk with as much care and discipline as they think about financial risk or political risk, where they have a whole set of lobbyists and capitalists throughout the globe focused specifically on mitigating political risk? What's your sense? Do you think that there, as the sense I'm getting is from the shaking, the head's going sideways, is probably not as much attention to talent-related risk as perhaps other kinds of risk factors?
I think they are aware, but they have no clue how to handle it. So for that reason, they just
Right. Financial risk looks like really specific, concrete. Talent risk, vague, people. So that's what I'm hoping to demonstrate today, that actually you can put as much rigor, maybe even more, around some of these people-related risks than you, maybe even some of the financial risks. To this point, the first time I talked about this at an enterprise risk management conference, I was really nervous because I knew that every other speaker was an actuary. I am a psychologist. So I'm saying I'm going to go out there and well, the first talk was about reputational risk. Well, how do you quantify reputational risk? If you issue a poor quality product, or if one of your senior leaders is caught cheating or insider trading or some other integrity issue, how do you put a value on it to figure out, should you be more rigorous around who you promote, who you select, is it worth the investment? Well, it turns out that we actually have a lot of rigor around what we do in the risk division in the talent space. And we can really make it a much more disciplined process. However, we have to convince the C-suite that we have that capability. When I talk to HR audiences about talent-based risk, my message is simply this. If this is the language, enterprise risk, that the C-suite is talking about and thinking about, we should adopt some of that language. We don't have to change what we're doing, but we just have to adopt this language. So, I don't think you self-selected into this room. You could have gone to parallel sessions, which I know are good and interesting sessions, but they're not about talent. So I don't think I need to convince the folks in this room that talent is a strategic risk, that boards are increasingly focused on non-financial factors, certainly since 2008, right, where risk, people-related risk, I work sometimes at very senior levels of organizations where they have to prepare reports to the board around succession planning. Succession planning is nothing other than a risk mitigation strategy. Because we know that when the top person or a top person leaves abruptly and there's no designated successor ready now to really step into her or his shoes, that creates risk to the organization. We know that shareholders react very negatively to that. And that stock price and shareholder value or market capitalization value goes down drastically when there's no clear, appropriate succession plan in place. So boards today, at least on an annual basis, if not twice a year, they want to know which are the critical positions at the top of the organization, and what's the succession plan for each one of those positions. So that's a talent issue that now has the attention of boards. And it's underinvestment. So if you look at, this is from a study done in The Economist in 2007. So if you look at credit risk, organizations are really careful about that, right? If you look at market risk, if you look at regulatory risk, the big gap here is around talent risk. 60% say there's a real threat, and 34% say the organization's got it under control. Organizations are faced with 4 key challenges in managing talent-related risk. How can we understand the impact of talent risk on our finances? How can we identify and compare in a rigorous way different talent risks? Which is a bigger threat to our business? How can we measure our risk exposure in order to guide where we spend our money? When it comes to, say, the demographic risk that we talked about before that was discussed by Sunday at lunch, is it a a question of buy or pay. Should we close the gap between the skill sets that we need and the skills that are available inside the organization by going out there and paying higher salaries? Is that where we should invest to get the talent? Or should we bring people in right out of school and develop them internally for 4 or 5 years to get them to the point where they're going to have the skills that we need? I'll give you an example of the impact. And there's more and more, in my field of organizational psychology, there's more and more research that links some of these HR interventions and people practices to dollar and cents outcomes. So this is an example. Engagement levels and business performance risk. This comes from AON Hewitt's research on engagement. So it turns out, if you look at engagement, organizations with engagement levels over 65% versus engagements levels under 45%, what you get is a huge difference in total shareholder value, total shareholder return. 22% above average for their industry versus 28% below average for their industry. A huge difference from whether or not you invest in building an engaged workforce. I want you to think a little bit, and again, I can spend a lot of time on the next 5 slides. I want to give you a flavor of why I'm arguing that talent-related risks are going up. Yeah, put it back on. Yes. Great question. Sorry. In many large organizations, there is an attempt to measure the degree to which the employee workforce is engaged. In other words, that they're committed, they strive, they want to stay with the organization, they identify with the values of the organization. They, when they're out talking to their friends on weekends or twittering with their friends, they're saying good things about their employer. That's all an index of engagement. And in many large organizations around the world, not just in the US, there's an attempt to systematically assess on a regular basis, every year and a half, every 2 years, the level of engagement of the workforce. And you can look, some great organizations, 80% of the employees are really engaged. They're delighted to be working there. They're really committed to the goals of the organization. They really demonstrate discretionary effort to achieve above and beyond what's expected of them in their jobs. And then there are organizations where those engagement levels are 20 or 30%, where a huge number of the employees are disengaged. They're there for a paycheck, but they'd be happy to leave at the first opportunity. So that's engagement level. So, in my view, these are some of the trends impacting talent risk. I want to very briefly talk about 5 of these trends. Economic, social, technological, millennials or generational, and then the whole issue of talent acquisition. So, you guys in the back are probably not reading some of these small, they come from different sources, but this is the key thing I want to talk about. So if you look at economic trends, there's tremendous growth pressures. We talked about it today. There is increased regulation. There's uncertainty. We live in economic uncertain times. We don't live in bad times. We just live in some countries. I was just in Europe 2 weeks ago. I was in Spain where the unemployment rate among young people under 25, is 50%. So those are bad times. But even in the U.S., with a fairly strong economy, we live in a very uncertain set of times. This is certainly not a recovery like others, where there was, generalized confidence across the board. We live in an era of economic permanent whitewater, where there's just a lot of uncertainty. We heard about the mismatch between labor and jobs. This is a scary one. You probably can't read this. I will read this to you because it's a little It's a little scary. In the U.S. alone, over 317,000 waiters and waitresses have college degrees. Over 8,000 of them have doctoral professional degrees. Along with 80,000 bartenders and over 18,000 parking lot attendants have college degrees. So there's this mismatch of labor and jobs. Social trends. So you heard it before. So Sonny again said that by 20, I forgot the year he said, 2050 maybe, or maybe before that, less than 50% of the folks in the U.S., citizens of the U.S., will be Caucasians. There's incredible diversity in the workforce because of longevity of generations. We're the first workforce that has 4 distinct generations working right now. There's a new definition of careers. There's a new deal between employers and employees. Employers broke the long-standing tradition that you work here for life. And now they turn around and feel like these young people today just are always looking to jump around. But in a certain sense, that psychological contract was violated by organizations. And increased use of the contingent workforce. So again, just to, this just all backs it up, and there's more detail, but just 75% of senior executives from the top 20 ranked companies in the global workplace identify the company's culture as the most valuable benefit. People, we can attract people and have them stay here because of the kind of culture that we build. Technology trends. So I work a lot in the area of employee selection, and in many of the companies that I work for, the distinction between a job applicant and a consumer is entirely blurred. One of my clients, for example, is AT&T. We have a selection test that's used to identify the folks who get hired to work in their retail stores, where you get your iPhones or where you get a certain plan, mobile plan. Well, guess what? Almost everybody who applies for that job is also somebody who owns an iPhone and is an AT&T subscriber. And that means that almost every applicant they say no to is also a customer, and a customer that they want to keep. So the line has been blurred a lot between a consumer brand and an employment brand. The use of mobility and social platforms to promote a company's reputation. Big data, cloud computing, and then Moore's Law. This was a scary one. Anybody know what Moore's Law is? What's Moore's Law? No, that's Murphy's Law. What's Moore's Law? So, exactly. So Moore's Law is that every 18 months, the power of technology doubles. Right? I think Moore was one of the founders of Intel, if I'm not mistaken. So, but I never realized the implication of Moore's Law until I sat down with somebody a couple of months ago and he said, you know what the implications are? Think about 2013 as the midpoint of a 20-year period that started in 2003 that will go to 2023. According to Moore's Law, in that 20-year trend journey, at which we're the midpoint now, we have gone 2% of the way. So when we anticipate what technology will look like in 2023, let alone 2050, there's still 98% left to go, according to Moore's Law. How scary is that? So, it's clear that this has implications for talent. So, for example, in my own work, it used to be that when we worked with organizations and they assessed folks for hire, People came to an employment office, remember that? And they sat at a desk, and there was somebody from HR who interviewed them, and there was somebody who, from the employment office who then gave them a test to take. And they took that test right at a desk under tight proctored conditions, and then that test was scored, and then somebody came out and said, congratulations, we'd like you to move on to the next stage and meet your boss or do a plant visit or whatever. Today, we administer 10 million tests a year. The majority of them today on mobile devices. Smartphones, iPads, where people 24/7, anytime, go online and say, oh, I'm interested in pursuing this job. They get on the job site. They can watch a little video about what it is like to work in that place. Then they click over and they take one of our tests. And then they're told, this is great. Here's a scheduling program for you to come in and get interviewed at a location near you. The GPS figures out what a location near you is. And you schedule yourself. That's the expectations and the impact of technology on talent. Millennials. So they value flexibility. They want work-life integration, growth in education. So, for example, career paths and career choice. When I work with organizations today, and maybe in your experience as well, one of the key things that I'm working on a lot more today than I did a few years ago is career pathing. Because the millennials coming in, they want to know what the journey's going to look like. They're not looking for guarantees. They understand that there's risk and they understand all of that. But they want to know, I'm in this job. Once I get good at this job, what's my next step? What's my step after that? And that's all around career paths. And then here's one that's very specific for agribusiness. According to the National Association of College Employers, manufacturing is ranked number 4 of the top 5 industries that pay the highest salaries to 2012 bachelor degree graduates regardless of majors. And yet, among 18 to 24-year-olds, manufacturing remains dead last among industries in which they would choose to start their career. So if you're in manufacturing, you have this real gap between what you have to offer, and you heard it. You're going to hear it throughout this conference. You have exciting careers that are on the technological edge, that have real transcendent social value and meaning for people, on the one hand, and yet you have a branding problem that creates a tremendous amount of risk around the attractiveness of opportunities in manufacturing. And then finally, talent acquisition. So you have baby boomers, mobile recruiting, who's the job applicant, which I touched on before. I mean, just to give you a sense of who's the job applicant. We're working with some companies now where, here's what they do. They go on college campuses, not literally go on college, but they launch at a college campus a game. And it's one of these group interactive web-based games where you play with other people. I don't know, to conquer a country or whatever the people do on those games. I'm not from that generation, so I must admit, I'm not one of the participants. But the notion is that it is geared to measure problem solving, collaboration, some of the very traits that were discussed earlier today that are really important in your business and other businesses. And then when your company when Cargill comes on campus and wants to, comes to Purdue and says, do we want to recruit 5 people or 10 people or 15 people, the gamer, the assessment company, can present the recruiter with the 30 people on campus or 40 people on campus who have the highest scores in collaboration and problem solving and persistence and conscientiousness based on this game. Very different way of recruiting using technology. I talked to a young man who started an incubator company about a year ago for financial services companies. And he measures accounting skills and finance skills on these tests. And what he does is he uses LinkedIn and he says to those folks, look, Goldman Sachs is looking to hire people, click here to take a test. And then what he does is he goes to Goldman Sachs and he says, I had, in the space of 1 week, 5,000 people go online and take your test, and here are my test. And here are the 20 people who scored highest, and here's their email addresses. Go after them. That's his business model. And he's using very rigorous, valid assessment tools to do that. So that's the future. Let alone, and I don't even want to go there because I don't have time, all of the web scraping that's going to be taking place. I mean, you saw it downstairs. Did any of you see that screen in the back that used, what's it called? But it wasn't Twitter. It was called, there was a program that scrapes Twitter to look at which words. BuzzRadar, thank you. And then shows you the words in terms of the size of the font as a reflection of how frequently it's used. Well, not only cloud and the new LinkedIn endorsement pages, but there is capability now, for example, to analyze Twitter, not just to simply report the words that you use over the last 1,000 Twitters that you sent, but to analyze it in terms of its intellectual complexity to come up with a measure of your general intelligence, and to look at the words that you use that are more positively affected versus negatively affected to get a measure of your optimism and pessimism. And there is research that's emerging now from my colleagues in my field that actually correlate those scores with more traditional measures of those personality traits or those intellectual abilities, and those correlations are strong. So that is part of the technology future that's going to impact on talent. Again, all this says is that there's a dearth of leadership talent. There's a dearth of talent in many areas. In your business and in all businesses, there's a real dearth of leadership talent. Many employers are already experiencing a leadership shortage, and you see this. So here's a gap, 46 versus 11. Very important to my company. We do this effectively. We meet the talent skill needs at the management level, the senior leadership level, key professional levels. Over and over again, these are the risks that occur based on those gaps. And leadership shortages have serious implications. This comes from the AON Benefits and Talent Survey. What we can see is that leadership shortage is a true enterprise risk. Which brings me to the next section that I'm going to just sort of give you an overall model and then show you some examples really quickly. How do you go back to your companies and assess what your leadership, or what your talent-related risks are? How do you figure out what the risks are and which are the key ones, the ones that you really have to sweat, that ought to keep your CEO up at night? So going back to here, what I've done is my preference is to take those risks and organize them according to the employment life cycle. You might think of risks in your own model. This is one that I use. And I go through a process like this in order to identify these risks. And again, I said that I'll be happy to send you this material if you give me your cards. So number one, obviously, let's identify the talent risks. So you kick off the project, you start collecting qualitative data by interviewing people, focus groups, benchmark data, to generate a big list of potential talent-related risks. I'm going to show you how this looks, or at least some of the instrumentation right after this slide. But this is the key slide. Next, what you want to do is do a quantitative risk analysis, which means collecting data from people on the severity of the risk, the frequency with which this risk occurs, and analyzing the data in order to take that list of 10 or 20 and bring it down to 5. Then what you we want to do is financial modeling. What, you'll see in a minute, I'll show you an example, but let's take that demographic risk. So let's say in the US, you're looking for trained geneticists working in the agricultural arena. And you know there's a real gap. You expect in your company, you're going to need 400 of these people. And in all of the United States, there are 400 being produced today. So you can say to yourself, okay, let's play with some models. Let's say you establish a scholarship fund, as we heard today, you grant to. A scholarship fund to attract more people into that educational pipeline. Well, let's say it increases the demographics from 400 to 800. What does that do to your risk? If it only increases it from 400 to 500, what does that do to your risk? And you can play with different models, and that's the financial modeling one. Same thing with retirees, with boomers. So you have all this knowledge that they have that's going to walk out the door when they retire. So the question is, are they going to retire? Okay, so they're 60 or 62 or 65, but are they going to retire? Well, one of the things we have historically is they are more likely or less likely to retire depending on how the financial markets are working. Whether their money in their 401k plans are increasing in value or decreasing in value or staying flat. Again, you can financially model that. What if the market goes up 20% over the next 3 years? What if it goes down 10% in the next 3 years? What will that do to the loss of boomers retiring and the risk that it creates in your organization? You can model it in different ways. Then you come up with a governance structure and you mitigate the risk and then you measure the results. So that is the model that we use when we want to work with organizations, or a model that you could use in your own organizations to try to figure out what are the key talent risks. Compiling a list of 20 does nothing. But identifying, here are 3 really critical ones. Here's mitigation strategies. Here's the potential impact of those 3 risks based on reasonable assumptions. Here's how you can mitigate those risks. Let's try it, and let's measure the results. So this is just, the next 3 or 4 pages are just showing you how this is done. So this is how you go from the universe of risks, the key ones, to the ones that you really want to focus on. These are the kinds of risks that might come up. And again, remember I showed you, I organize them according to the employment life cycle. But you could use any kind of structure you'd like to. So talent and skill shortages. Poor talent selection. Now there's a risk. You're picking the wrong person. So, of course, you can't oversell better selection as a mitigation strategy. I have a story, and some of you may end up seeing this in the newspapers. Reuters calls me last week. They want to know, what could the NSA have done better to make sure that Mr. Snowden was not hired? Right? Could they have weeded him out in the selection process? I said, actually, probably not. One guy like one rogue in the employment workforce of 25,000. That some risks you just have to live with. That's why we talk about in enterprise risk management, risk mitigation. We're not so naive as to talk about risk elimination. Every time you bring in the talent, there's risk. The question is, are we mitigating the risk? So employment practices, labor relations, safety. In your industry, safety is a very big issue related to enterprise risk. Obviously there are extreme cases like BP and the Gulf of Mexico, but there are smaller cases where there's very large enterprise risk. And then, leadership, talent management we talked about. We talked about engagement before, leadership, and then exiting. Are Is there risk around the retirement of people who are thought leaders or experts who have deep knowledge that is going to walk out the door when they retire? And how do we mitigate that risk? So, and you can't read this, but just, it's up there more so that you know that we're not talking here about fluff and nebulous kinds of things. For almost every one of these risks, we, meaning those of you in this audience who work in the human resources area, we have measures for every one of these risk factors. And this is just a list of some of those measures. So we have workforce compensation costs. We have accident rates. We have turnover. We have employee productivity. We have succession plan, percentage of employees with succession plans in place. We have hiring costs. We have recruiting costs. We have number of retirees returning over. We have metrics around many of these things. And this is how you can, again, this is just a sample of how you can rate the degree of severity of the risks. This is how you can identify leadership risks. You know, you go to your employee survey. Did you ever think about looking at the percentage of leaders with a less than 3.5 rating to identify a risk factor for your organization? This is just a sample. Or this is the financial modeling I talked about before. So you can forecast termination by age. You can forecast terminations as a function of year, or as a function of, what does your demographic distribution look like? There was a Harvard Business Review article about 3 years ago on the nuclear energy industry in Germany. So what happened was, in Germany, as in many countries, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, nuclear energy was the great hope. And a lot of smart young people went and became nuclear engineers and worked at the power companies. And then, like in other countries, after 3 Mile Island, there was a slowdown in the growth of nuclear power plants and their construction. So young people didn't go into that field. Well, guess what? All those people who went into the field before 3 Mile Island in the 70s are now of retirement age. But they still have plants that need to be run. Well, who's going to run the plants if we're not producing the people trained to do that work? And this is just a sample of how you can summarize a risk. You can create a risk dashboard. In this case, severe. You can talk about the value levers, action plans for mitigating the risks. You can look at metrics, who owns the risk. That's just an example of a template you could use in your organizations to identify the 3 or 4 greatest talent-related risks. And then let's look at mitigation. So none of these are surprising. These are what we do. Going back to what I said earlier, a lot of what I've talked about today with respect to identifying and mitigating talent risk is about taking what it is that we do as human resources professionals, as leaders who care about the talent in our organizations, and putting it, organizing it, expressing it in a risk framework. So we know that to mitigate risk around compliance or labor relations, that we need to have a rigorous and well-validated performance management process so that rewards are not given out arbitrarily. We know that if we have a talent skills shortage, we better have a really great recruitment process, getting at the sources that will provide that talent and providing the appropriate training. And if we happen to have a gap that we can't solve between the skills that it takes to do a good job and the skills that we can get from the outside, we better redesign the job. We heard today about robotics. So if we can't get people to do some of those jobs, I'm going back to what Sonny said about the fact that we can't get producers in this country. Even children of migrant workers don't want anything to do with farming. Well, to me, the answer is probably then going to come through job redesign. how much of the work of producers can be transferred to robots instead of people. Because we better do that, because we're just not going to have the people. But we still have to double our production. So these are just all sorts of mitigating strategies that can be used to reduce talent risk. Not eliminate, but reduce talent risk. I'm getting towards the end, and hopefully you'll have comments and discussion. I've got only 2 more slides, I think. So how do you go back to your organizations and increase sensitivity to the talent side of enterprise risk, and increase buy-in for some of the for the need to analyze what are the sources of that risk, which are the critical ones, and therefore which ones should we invest in mitigating? How do you do that? Well, what you see up there is similar to every single organizational change effort you'd ever want to do, no matter what the context. You need commitment from the top. You need to get buy-in across the organization. This is basic for those of you who've read it. It's basic Cotter, John Cotter, change management. You need to be rational. I hope if I've convinced you of nothing in the last hour, it is that this whole process of the talent side of enterprise risk can be disciplined, can be rigorous, can be quantitative. It's not HR people just dreaming up things that ought to be done by the organization because it feels good, but because it's core to the viability of the organization. You need to embed talent risk in processes across the organization. That comes about, for example, when the senior executive has his managers around the table and asks the question, who are your key players on your team? What is the flight risk of each one of those players, and what is the impact if that person left? I just went through that process yesterday afternoon at Grant Review. We went through 40 people with the CEO and his direct report. We went through a list of 40 people. Those were the 2 questions we asked about each one, among other things. What is the flight risk on a 3-point scale? And what is the impact if that person did leave on your ability to achieve your goals and objectives for your business unit? And then we looked at those 30-odd people, and we came to the 6 people who were A, high flight risk, and B, if they left, there would be a huge impact on their business. And then the next 2 hours was focused in on those 6 people. How do we do 2 things? Reduce the likelihood that the person is a flight risk, and B, how do we mitigate the impact of the risk in case he leaves? Because it is not indentured servitude. It is a free society, and no matter what we do, giving that person long-term incentives, whatever the things that we try to do to keep the person, they may leave, and we've got to do whatever possible to mitigate the negative impact of that person leaving. We can't be so beholden to our viability and ability to perform as a business to whether or not we can retain that one person. We never want to do that in an organization. So that's an example of embedding a talent risk orientation throughout the organization. And you really have to have a commitment to risk. This is my next to last slide, which is about governance. So once your organization starts thinking about enterprise risk management through a talent lens and mitigating talent risk, you need to set up processes. So that's part of life, of the governance processes in that organization. And all I want you to see is that different players are involved and have different roles. Everyone has a role. CEO has a role, the CO has a role, the CFO has a role, counsel has a role, VP of HR has a role, and VP of technology, and probably there are more roles than that. But certainly all 6 of these folks have a role in governing the fact that we are minimizing enterprise risk through the lens of talent. This is the last slide. This is my summary slide. It really is a stakeholder talent risk set of questions about risk awareness, risk mitigation, and risk governance. Those are the three stages. I mean, it would be great to go back with a page like this and really get the conversation going in your organizations. What are your organization's chief talent risks? Maybe it's the VP for supply chain in Western Europe. Maybe it's your biggest talent risk is the head of R&D, who's a world-class, world-renowned scientist. So it's not just that he or she is a generator of innovation. He or she is also a magnet for all those talented people who are dying to work in your organization just for the chance to bask in his light. And what is the impact? And which units are going to be most effective? Maybe the talent risk has to do with how you make decisions in the organization. Maybe it has to do with the degree of innovation in the culture or lack of innovation in the culture. Then what do you do to mitigate the risk? This category is a lot about taking the bag of tricks that we in HR have and in talent management have and making rational decisions about how to apply them. What should we invest in based on the size of the risk, and then embedding it into our organization. Let me throw it open for questions, challenges. I'm done. Yes, please.